doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
And Andrew, can you just please highlight the important role that ICC is playing to sustain confidence in the global trading system, and where you see opportunities for African as well as global institutional investors to support and participate in commercially viable transactions in a post-COVID-19 economy? Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Hubert, and apologies to everyone for not being John Denton. I'll try to do my best Australian accent, which I'll do particularly well there. Just a very quick word on the International Chamber of Commerce, just to make sure everyone knows who we are. And if anyone heard the acronym ICC, I have to say we're not the International Criminal Court, don't worry.
Andrew, I apologize for that. Oh. Andrew, sorry, can I just jump in a second? I've just realized that we have one of our dignitaries, Mr. Lynn de Rothschild, on, so we just really wanted to recognize the Organization for Inclusive Capitalism, the coalition. You're welcome, colleagues. Okay, fantastic. Sorry about that interruption, Andrew, please proceed. Okay. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, this is a... Thank you, Hubert. So just a quick word on the International Chamber of Commerce. As some of you may know, we're the world's largest business organization, representing in the region of 45 million member companies, many of which inevitably are SMEs, which have been particularly affected by this crisis. And we have a footprint in something in the region of 130 countries across the world. The more interesting thing I just wanted to focus on is the origins of the organization. We were founded in 1919 at the end of the First World War and at the height of the Spanish flu pandemic by a group of far-sighted industrialists, principally from the US and Europe, who had a vision that global commerce could be a way to actually stop future wars. So essentially the idea that if goods, services, and people cross borders, then ultimately troops wouldn't. And I think as we look at the state of the world today in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we find ourselves at a similar inflection point. The choices that we take today in relation to trade and commerce and the free movement of goods and people will ultimately determine the shape of the global economy in the future. There is to be one for the next 10, possibly even 30 years. And the dichotomy we see emerging right now is essentially one between retreat or resilience. How do we respond to this? Is it to retreat behind national borders, to put the barriers up to global trade and the free movement of people? Or is it to critically assess some of the failings that COVID-19 has brutally exposed and build resilience in the global system? To us, the latter notion of resilience is far more compelling, and all available historical economic evidence points to that being the way forward. But I think inevitably we have to be fully aware that we do face a resurgence of protectionist and nationalist sentiment, and that really does risk impeding future economic growth. In the context of the immediate crisis, our work is very much focused on making the case for open markets, making the case for the importance of the rules-based multilateral system, and also critical regional agreements. But more broadly than that, or more specifically than that, there are specific things that we've pointed to in many parts of our advocacy. You may have seen our Save Our SMEs SOS campaign, that governments can do to actually utilize trade policy, not only to speed the response to the health crisis caused by the pandemic, but also to give SMEs a vital lifeline. So we see a huge problem in terms of unnecessary trade barriers on medical goods, for instance. Likewise, we see excessive customs inspections, which are understandable at one level, given the public health dimension to the crisis, but have a significant impact on the supply of essential goods, including perishable foods, for instance, but also significantly impact the ability of SMEs to weather this crisis. And delays at borders can have a significant impact on cash flow at best of times for SMEs. And in this crisis, those delays can prove fatal. But looking forward more broadly, so that there are things that can be done in trade policy terms in the short term. We continue to champion those with governments to ultimately varied effects. But I just wanted to focus in on the broader, longer term discussion and this notion specifically of retreat or resilience. And I think this is where the African Continental Free Trade Agreement assumes huge importance for the continent based on our initial modeling and our initial thinking. In a retreat scenario where you see Western economies, certainly the US, perhaps even the European Union, start to impose protectionist barriers, the Continental Free Trade Agreement actually could be an incredibly useful insurance policy in terms of opening up a really significant untapped market within the continent today. But in the resilience scenario, which we certainly hope will be what we come to see in the next few years, it's almost inevitable that rather than talking about reshoring, there will be a significant debate about building resilience in supply chains through diversification. So the concentration we've seen in certain sectors, such as the garment and textile sector, since the end of the multi-fiber agreement under the WTO, will ultimately, we think, become more of a grazing model. So we see significant value chain, supply chain opportunities opening up, and concentration of certain supply chains ultimately diminishing over time. So in that scenario, not only is there an opportunity to build intra-African trade, which is clearly vital, but also to prepare Africa's readiness to tap global markets more broadly. So a really significant opportunity, I think, potentially coming out of this crisis in either respect. The question is to Ahmed, how to maximize the potential value of that. We would certainly advocate for expert implementation of the Continental Free Trade Agreement as a core part of the response to COVID-19 on the part of African governments and the African Union more broadly. Excuse me. What I would say though is to get there, that will require significant reforms. And our view, given that there are limited resources, is to target those reforms or prioritize those reforms where they can have most immediate impact. And we see two particular areas. The first is on trade facilitation. So how do you make it easier for goods to cross borders? All the available modeling from the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, shows that the higher the cost to get goods across borders, the less SMEs export. And in a number of African economies, trade facilitation costs are incredibly high. So we would certainly advocate for doubling down on trade facilitation reforms informed by local private sector views. So the views of local businesses, what are the real problems that they actually face in terms of importing or exporting, but also the views of investors. Where are there potential investment opportunities if trade is made simpler, easier, and more cost effective? That I think also calls not just for policy reform, but significant infrastructure investment to build trade readiness, roads, ports, airports, and broader trade-related infrastructure. And if that infrastructure can be coupled with a dynamic, business-relevant policy agenda, then there's an enormous opportunity to open up free trade across the continent. Second, on infrastructure investment, very quickly, it's very, very clear that COVID-19 has accentuated some of the efficiencies in the trading system caused by its reliance on trade. So we see a real need for investment in systems and infrastructure, both in terms of essential access to broadband and 4G, for instance, but more broadly to enable digitized trading systems. We no longer need to see paper-based documents, but ultimately we want to see digital systems enabled by blockchain technology, for instance, to enable security within the trading system. The final thing, very quickly, trade facilitation is absolutely vital in terms of, and related infrastructure, in terms of enabling trade, and we think that should be a priority area for implementation of the free trade agreement. But just very quickly, from an investment perspective, one other issue I wanted to touch on is the issue of trade financing. So trade financing is an asset class which is in many ways an absolute bundle of contradictions. It's essential to the economy, but not particularly dynamic or necessarily exciting to many investors. It underpins a significant amount of global trade. It's relatively low risk, but at the same time, it's incredibly vulnerable to economic shocks of the kind we're seeing. Only this week, we issued a paper which estimated the potential gap in trade financing coming out of this crisis if we want to see a semblance of a V-shaped recovery in the order of around $5 trillion US. And there are signs emerging in the market already that the market is beginning to show stresses with pricing points going up, but also utilization of a number of regional development bank schemes escalating at a time when trade flows overall are ultimately going through the floor. So we think coming out of this crisis, not only is it necessary to make trade easier, we also need to make sure that entrepreneurs have the access to finance that they need to trade across borders with the necessary security. And we think there's a tremendous case for institutional investors, such as pension funds, to look at trade finance assets as an investable asset class. There's some interesting work being done to securitize standard bank intermediated trade finance products. Their risk profile, and I'd encourage anyone who's interested in this to look at the findings of the ICC Trade Finance Register, which we established 10 or so years ago, which really emphasizes the low risk profile of this asset class, even through times of deep recession potentially. And we think there's a real need we think there's an opportunity to see trade finance as an investable asset class. But this will be absolutely vital, because if you get the policy forms right, if markets do stay open, if there's not this retreat and instead an approach centered on resilience, but if the financial markets can't actually service demand in the economy and provide finance to small businesses in particular, then ultimately the policy reforms will generate nothing. So I'll really emphasize the importance of trade finance in terms of thinking about the strategic approach to implementation of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I'd encourage the institutional investors on the call to view it as an area for possible low risk, good yield investments going forward.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.